Hey Chris, what's going on?
Saturday, 7:32. Time to talk education, uh, or more life. Who knows? Our on ramp sort of took a little pins and needles out of the life combo, but I'm more than happy to start with battle fatigue.
You're right about the on ramp. The on ramp was short and it was steep. I think we hit it hard, and then I think you were about to say, "Okay, let's hit broadcast." I'm not sure, and then I went ahead and interrupted you and said, "Let's do it. Let's get
Yeah.
on."
Yep. Yeah,
Is
I'm
that what
okay.
happened?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Absolutely fine. I think I think we're hitting a little bit of stride here, a synchronicity where one of us has to call it, because there's also that familiarity. We could just sit and chat and then kind of look, oh crap, we didn't hit the record button. And this has happened. It's definitely happened to me with in grabbing podcasts or capturing any kind of audio reflective conversations, that the rapport end of it, sometimes the good stuff is there, but you don't want to blindside and just start record from the beginning. I've also learned that it's good to say, okay, we're hitting record now. But it's funny how often in those conversations we end up saying something like, yeah, I love what we were talking about just before we hit record.
Yeah, I get that, but at the same time, I think for me, the on ramp's important. Like, it's important just to get out some things that might be just like on the tip of your tongue that you don't necessarily want to throw out on air.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I mean, and it's what it brings to mind really. I don't know. It's if anyone, I'll say maybe someone's listening to this podcast. Let's assume people are listening to this podcast, and part of it that we touched on this, I think, last week, is that switch we've made into, it's still edu talk and we still chat about school. It's still loaded with, like, we wouldn't, if someone were listening and we're looking for specific, um, like, I don't know, pedagogical gold. I guess there's bits and pieces of that. So we have all the key terms and the key IDs that are in there. But it's fascinating how there's like that. I don't know. Like, it's a total bait and switch in the conversation. Like, if someone were listening to our podcast and expecting it to be linear in any fashion, they may almost think that yeah, exactly. Sorry, I laughed. Those of you that are just listening and not watching, there was a vote that just happened, and it was a slight thumbs down. That the linear nature of the podcast, and it's funny though, because that is in my other world of podcasting, and maybe was a little bit a part of your world too. That there was a sense of pursuing a conversation. There's that element of letting the conversation evolve and kind of pop, and to be able to sort of chase down some of those spaces that maybe you had 3 or 4 questions that fascinated you about your guest. But now this, I think what you and I have sort of moved it into a different zone. And I think in some ways it models the everyday conversations that happen about education and life. And those are the ones that happen so readily all the time. You sit down in the staff room, you're in the halls. It isn't always as straightforward as, I would really like to hear about the ed tech tool that you're currently using. So what I've said it before, what I've really come to appreciate in this is, well, one, I've embraced your POV on the on ramp, because I think when we first started out, we go back a few episodes, I was like, come on, man, let's just make this fresh. Let's go right to record and see what happens. And it's a little bit like the shocking the system a bit. And I think if you end up not spending some time arriving in the conversation, and this is where we get maybe into something that's more teachery, arriving in the conversation and make sure that everybody that's there has arrived, then you're going to end up using that time when you're in the conversation anyways. Like, it has to be there. Yeah, so it's funny. I've come to embrace that. And someone listening to this may actually, every time we kind of mention, or we're kind of laughing, or we kind of footnote back to something that happened just before tape, I sometimes wonder if, anyone that's listening, God, like, I wish we could have heard that too. Because we don't really have outtakes. This is it. This is everything apart from whatever we're on fire for before we hit record, right? A little bit of sparring on the front end and like, okay, let's hit record. And I appreciate, especially when you say, okay, let's go to tape, because it's almost like that cue. It's like, okay, I'm good, you're good, let's go for it. Is school like that? Sort of make that jump.
Yeah, it is. And it, like you said, you have a plan, right? You have a lesson plan, or like a general outline of what you want to happen and where you want to lead the students, right? But those teachable moments creep in, or they're teachable moments. So you might be doing something and then it will remind you of something that's happened in your life or in your day. And then you make that connection, but you model that for the students in elementary. So you'll say, I'll be in the middle of working with them and I'll think of a really good thing that's happened in my life that I can share with them. And as I'm doing that, I'm telling them, I'm sharing my connection with you. This is why making connections are important. And then you kind of like, you take that side step, you do that mini lesson, then you step back into the original path that you were on. So it happens all the time. And maybe people aren't aware of it. And maybe there are some really super focused people that just like laser in and go. But I find in elementary, it's a marathon, right? You're running the same race for 10 months and with the same people. So to me, it's important that you don't just have a laser focus, because if you're just laser focused, you're going to miss so much that's happening around you. So many moments that are important to share with the students and to make them aware of. So I guess as I'm doing my work every day with them, I'm aware of what's happening around us, and how can I build it in so that they get more of a robust education, like an idea of how this stuff works when you're an adult. Because I don't want them to just wait until they're an adult to start doing some of these things. I want them to start doing it now. And so, like the podcasting conversation, the linear doesn't work for me. Like, I mean, it's important to, like I said, you have a plan, right? Like my long range plans, they're printed off, they're linear, but I mean, I've built them so that I can jump back and forth depending on, it's like a term plan. It's here's my final destination this term, but I can't tell you the route that I'm going to take because I might start running this way. And then I get sick and tired of what I'm seeing along my path. And then I decide to take a scenic route, which leads me down another way. But at the end of the day, I'm going to get to the same place I'm supposed to be at the end. So they both linear, and I guess what's the opposite of linear? I'm gonna say the word dynamic, but that's not what it is. But just being aware of both and being open to both, I think it's important. It's an art. And I wanted to say that when you were talking about your podcast and that you've got questions for your guests, there are things you want to know. But my favorite parts of my podcast were when we'd be going down this road and they would say something or tell me something about themselves or about what they're up to at the moment. And I would start writing new questions down. So at the end of my podcast, I would have a ton of questions on my paper. Most of them were unanswered, or else I'd be talking for 4 or 5 hours, which, looking back now, I think I should have taken the opportunity every now and again to just let it go, right? Like typically I would shoot for an hour, 45 to 60 minutes or a little bit over. But now that I look back, I think here and there I could have pulled a Joe Rogan and I could have gone for 2 hours talking to somebody who had something to say and who, like, I genuinely wanted to know these things about them. So I wouldn't say that's a regret now, but I think I should have done that. I should have broken the mold a little bit. But yeah, those were the best conversations. The ones where I stuck to my questions and didn't go anywhere, those for me were the most boring conversations I had. And looking back, I can see that now. When I was actually doing it, I didn't feel that way. But now that I look back, and actually, you you would hear about some of my interviews. So I remember connecting with you and saying, I spoke to this person and I really didn't get a good vibe. So what do? Do I publish the podcast? Do I leave it alone? What do I do? And I remember you dropped some nuggets of wisdom at the time around that whole thing. But that happened to me, which is pretty cool because I want to say 54 episodes. Maybe it's 48, but I did around 50 episodes. And it's so cool because now that I look back, I remember my favorite interviews or conversations, because I didn't want it to be an interview. I wanted it to be a conversation. And that's why when people would ask me for my questions, I would give them my standard questions. And then I would say, depending on how this conversation goes, it might go in a totally different direction. And so anyway, the people that were really open to that, those were great conversations. Those, in my opinion, were my favorite podcasts. The ones where people seemed a little bit hostile, and I don't mean that in an aggressive way. I just mean like they just didn't seem into it. And I think maybe they were doing me a favor, or they had said yes, they would do the podcast, and when it came time, they just weren't feeling it, or maybe something was happening in their life at the time that was sucking up their energy. I don't know. I just know that I can remember from all those episodes the good, bad, and the ugly, and the ones that I could have gone 2 hours, 2.5 hours. I'll give you an example. One of my conversations was with an educator named Catherine Flippin. I met Kat in California when I was at the Google Teacher Academy, and she was amazing. Like the way that she was doing her thing. She was one of our lead learners. So she wasn't a colleague who's sitting beside me soaking it up. She was one of the people delivering the content and the ideas and the concepts. And Kat, as she was living her life, she ended up having to deal with cancer. And then she got through it, and now she's on the other end. And my intention was not to spend a lot of time talking with her about cancer, but talking to her and asking her some of the questions that I started with, it led us down more of a road. Like it was stepping away from EDU and more into just like life and living life and being resilient. And, maybe having faith or not having faith, and family, and how all that stuff worked together. And that's an episode that I think I literally could have talked to her for 2.5 hours, because there was so much there. And she had my attention, right? Like I was interested, I was interested in her story, like as a human, her narrative, what she's gone through, how she's come out of it, what she's doing now, how she deals with it. And it's one of those podcasts, those episodes that just sits with me. And I love it because that's one of my experiences from that time of doing the work that I was doing back then. And so I appreciate you kind of letting me bring it back up, because, here we go again, right? Like we started on one path, and now I'm talking about when I used to podcast and how it played out and how it worked. You just never know. And most of the time my podcasts were around education. That was the filter. But when it stepped out of education, I was more than happy. And I tried, and I think I tried several times to speak with people on the podcast who were not educators. And I was able to get a few, but mostly, I just stuck with education. Those were the people that really wanted to talk. And I don't know where it would be today if it was still going, but I know that when I was doing it, I really enjoyed it. And when it was time to stop, it was time to stop.
It's an interesting moment. You make me think about that interesting moment in a conversation that when it turns, and it can be for positive and negative, I think we're probably I'm more aware when it turns to the negative. Maybe the emotions that come up around that, or the state of mind, confusion around that, is just imminent. It's right there. It's harder to sort of wrap your head around. And the good moments in the conversation, I mean, if you want to call them teachable moments or just the waiting time or productive struggle, whether it's in a conversation like this between you and I, or, you know, each with our private podcasts, or even in the classroom, I kind of wrestled this week with that, as in waiting time and noticing those moments. And it's a funny thing that often when we talk about teachable moments, one of the things that doesn't always follow the deconstruction of a teachable moment is the magic that's in that moment. And it's almost, to address it directly makes it less powerful than it is in some ways. It's like, I think I've had those conversations before where you sort of find out something that the kids think is really cool. Somehow it comes across your desk, and then you roll it into a lesson plan thinking that it's going to be awesome because the kids really think it's cool. And now what you've just done is you've co-opted the cool thing and made it about school, and the kids no longer want to. They're like, I don't want to do that in class. That's my thing that I do. And I think some of those moments that we notice either in conversation with our kids, our own children, our spouse, in our podcasts, it's really difficult. It's really difficult to pause in those moments. And it, you know, when you mentioned the whole, like, just going Joe Rogan on the convo and letting it flow. I mean, there's still no guarantee. Okay, so here's a couple observations on that. There's a lot of times in the podcast that I put together that I think, well, here's something that happens where, you know, I kind of check the clock and I'm like, yeah, man, we're creeping up on the hour. First off, bad move, because as soon as you do that, you totally lose the magic. Anything that could be building towards that cool moment, you're rebuilding again. So a little bit like what we were talking, you either do rapport on the front end to get the ball rolling and then kind of support it along the way. Or if you're building it along the way, you know, it takes more work, but it can happen. I think the second thing is when you stop building towards the possibility of that teachable moment or that aha or something that's magical, it's when you start to fall on kind of like that list of questions that you think you should be asking. And like you said, I learned that lesson early in my process, or my practice, I guess, of podcasting. You know, I walked formally away from my list of questions after episode 2. It's still there and I've added to it. But now what I've done is I've added questions to it that have popped up in the podcast. The ones that just kind of excited an idea, you know, or created a really good pause in the podcast that you don't edit out, because that's a powerful pause when you hit that kind of like, neither one of you know exactly what to say. And I've looked at the wavelengths before in the editing and listened to it again and again and again. And you're listening for, it's amazing how different that soundbite sounds, even in the absence of words, when the sync is off, like nobody really knows who's supposed to talk next, versus the great question or that moment that's there, because there's a different kind of electricity to it. And definitely when you're in the room like you and I right now, if there's, I mean, I'm assuming, I don't know what, I'm assuming that much of what we talk about is posted end to end. Do you do much editing on it? Or you just drop it? So, and this was part of our plan, let it go in the way that, you know, capture it live and release it. That's it. No harm, no bruise, no nothing. And I think about those moments in the classroom. I think about those moments with our colleagues. I think about those moments with my own children where I just work way too hard to stick to the list of questions. And that's, I think, one of the biggest gifts that I've given myself. It's also a really problematic gift because I still don't know what to do with it, but it's one of the biggest gifts that I've given myself as far as working with my colleagues, working with my students, and definitely connecting with my own family, is appreciating that moment of wait time and letting it flow when possible, letting it flow.
Yeah. So, okay. I don't know how many times I've said this on the podcast, but for me, it's all about time, right? So if I have a bit of time, I want to do this. And if I'm going to do this, I'm going to need more time to, like, you know, publish it to the blog and then send it out to iTunes or whatever. And so unless you or I do something really crazy and we say something that's really off limits, out of bounds, there's no editing. This is it. This is what you're getting, right? So, but and the only reason for that is because it works for me. So if I'm the one dealing with the back end, then that's what's happening right now. And traditionally, that's what's been going on. I know a couple times I've stepped in to do the back end work and publish this podcast, and I've noticed that you've been in YouTube and you've gone ahead and given the podcast a title or whatever, and I'm like, right on. I can turn this off now, and I can just run. And when I'm pointing to my head and I'm saying I turn my brain off, because I can then just go ahead and do my thing with what Chris has already done with it automatically. Like, you've just saved me 5 steps or whatever. So I just take what you've done, throw it in the blog, publish it. I think, and we've talked about this, you just got to do what works for you. And you and I both have, we have enough experience with what I'm calling amateur podcasting to play around with it. We know, the fastest way to push something out. So I'll give you an example. This morning, I got up and I did my regular stuff, and then I got to the computer a little early, and I was 2 episodes behind. So this is episode 23 today. I hadn't published 21 and 22, but in the short time I was able to grab 21 and push it out. So it's probably on iTunes right now, and it's definitely been posted on the blog. 22 is all but done. I just have to throw the audio into the cloud, and then it's good to go. So I'm like this close to catching up, and I've not had enough time, which sounds kind of weird, but I haven't had the time in the past 2 weeks to get up to this machine that I'm on right now and just dedicate, 20 to 35 minutes to do it. It's just not happened. There's not been an opportunity where I felt like, okay, I'm going to give that time that I have right now to the podcast. Didn't happen. There are other things. So for you and I right now, it's that smooth back and forth, right? We've got this thing going on. One of it is, like, one thing you call it is friendship. We have a friendship. We understand each other in this medium to do this type of thing, and it works for us. So it always comes back to that for me. It comes back to time, where you're willing to spend it, because we all have it, and then understanding what you're doing. And you and I have enough understanding to make it work in small time situations. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We've touched on when you gather enough, when you feel like you've gathered. Okay, so I'll do it a different route. It's easier for you and I to do what we're doing right now because of the grind that we've gone through in our own podcasts. Like this method that you and I are using, I won't lie, it's very much informed by, but also a reaction to the intensity that it kind of takes to do all the editing, everything, the end to end, the checking and the rechecking, like all that kind of stuff. I like that automation in this case helps us have a better conversation naturally. As you said, you post it, it gets sent to iTunes, it sort of gets out to all those social spaces so that others, if they choose to, they can listen to the conversation. The thing about my other podcast is that takes so much like steps along the way. Like there's very little automation to it. And part of it is probably because there's only me, as it was for you. There was only you. There's sort of like, you're just hyper aware of every single little step that you take along the way. Whereas it does feel like we're co-producing. I'll admit it, I'm lazy guy. I mean, in the scale of the post, you are doing more, like you're carrying more of the ball there. And I'm deeply appreciative of that. within that, I also realize that we're also making choices. I think you're making choices too, to keep even that side simpler, just to get the conversation out. That's the first thing that you made me think about. The other part too is that we've also been very clear with each other that the time that we, not only the time that you and I spend together is intentional. It's funny. It almost feels like it's, despite the fact we softly said, oh yeah, hey, let's try and do this every week. That'll be an interesting body of work to look back on, like a full school year. That's about as tight as our plan is. You know, let's see if we can get in. I don't even know what number of weeks that is, but 23 in some ways, I think a far better way to almost like, instead of episode 23, is to almost like saying this is week 23 of our process. And that completely changes the context and the pursuit. So what we've traded off on one side, maybe hyper-simplifying the production value, we've committed to a serial version of a podcast. And we're now in week 23, which is almost entirely in line with the number of weeks that we've had in the school year so far. I think maybe we've had one or two. So right now in the school year, we're somewhere around, week 24, week 25 in school time, right? Not with holidays and time away. So I love I think in some ways we've come to this space because what we're willing to embrace, with the complexity that we're willing to embrace, is something entirely different. It's no longer on that side of kind of futzing with so much of the technical elements. It's more spending considered time with each other and also pursuing a longer conversation. I don't know. I don't think I've had 23 weeks of continuous conversation with anyone at any time in all of my school experience. And I will say that as far as professional learning and personal growth, I don't know if I have not had a moment like this so far. And this includes me getting to know you, getting to know your context, me feeling like I've been heard with some of my thoughts. So this is something, even in the podcast world, I don't know if I've come across this either, especially considering we haven't brought a guest on yet. Like, it's just you and I recounting our week, which is kind of part two to our frame. Let's do this for a school year and let's just share our contexts. So I love the side bars that we get to, but I almost think like that's part of the heart of what this podcast is. We can be topical. We can review the week specifically from an external perspective, what impacted, what was out there, what's the latest tech tool. We've talked about that sometimes, but I think there's a whole lot of content out there that covers that ground. I'm not sure if there's much out there that I think celebrates the relationship between panels and between educators in the way that we've done. So totally appreciative of that and the opportunity to continue with it. And let's see where it goes. Maybe we'll do a second season, maybe not. We'll see at the end of the school year.
Yeah, I guess so. There's and I like, basically we're halfway through the school year. I know I am. I mean, we sent home our report cards the other day. So we're starting fresh in terms of evaluating and reporting to parents in the elementary panel here where I'm at. So I agree with everything you said. I think it's kind of cool. And then it reminds me to shift gears a little bit. So for the last half of our podcast, maybe we should purposely hit up something that happened this week, or what our kids are kind of in the middle of doing right now as a way to mark this halfway point, I guess. I don't know. I'm more than happy to tell you that my kids have hit a point where they're seeing fluency happen using technology. And so my example is this week, my students are working with Scratch coding, and what they're doing is they're writing a story that has to have at least 2 characters, and there has to be a back and forth dialogue, but there also has to be a problem and a solution to their story. And this is happening because they had used Scratch earlier on, a few weeks, 2 weeks ago maybe, where they were using Scratch to demonstrate their understanding in mathematics. And they weren't that familiar with Scratch. So I had a lot of students who were frustrated. A lot of students who were, weren't as interested as they could be. And I remember telling them, listen, the coding part is the experimental part. I'm not going after that. It's an opportunity for you to dive into this and to see if you really like it. Now we did Hour of Code in December. So coding is not like new to them. And in this day and age, they hear about it all the time. And almost all of them have some kind of experience with coding or understanding that there are apps out there and websites out there that they've been on that allow them to think in that way, right? To be able to process their thoughts and be able to make something happen based on logic. So anyway, they started really bothered, and now it's amazing. Like they're so far more advanced than I am that they come to me out of habit to say, hey, listen, I want you to take a look at this, and I want you to see if you can help me with this particular problem. And I tell them I'm more than happy to look at it, but I'm not as fluent as you are and the other kids in this room are, because I'm not sitting here coding. You're kind of thinking about the coding, thinking about the writing component of your assignment right now. My job is to facilitate that and to provide you with feedback to help you with the writing component, because that's kind of the area, the content area that we're working in. But the coding, that's like, you've got, 23 other experts around you. That's who you need to see. And then I need to listen to those conversations, and I need to observe what's happening, because there's a lot of the learning skills I can see there. I can see a lot of leadership. I can see a lot of growth mindset. Like, there's so much that I get to observe by watching my students work together to solve problems or to encourage each other. And so it's kind of neat that I can say to you in February that my kids are writing using coding, and they using the technology to get onto the internet is a joke. Like, they all do it all the time. They're fluent in that regard. And now some of them are really running away with the coding. They're really enjoying it. And so I encourage them to continue to do things like that, because I think it's important for them to know a little bit of it, but it's more important for them to engage in something that they find interesting, because some of my kids aren't really interested in the writing process. They're more interested in the coding aspect of it. But I get to benefit, right? Because they're creating amazing stories with my help and the help of other students. And then I get to evaluate them on that as they near the end, and they've got some kind of product for me to talk to them about and evaluate. And some kids really like the writing process and don't like the coding process. But again, I get to benefit because I'm the one that's going to get to evaluate their work, and they're getting there. And so it's really cool to see that, to step back and to talk to you about that. That's just one example of my students moving in the right direction. They're using the tech because it's engaging, it's fun. It's so awesome how they can share their work with me, and I don't have to get up and go see them, and they don't have to get up and come see me, right? Like, we have a place where we park our Scratch stories. And as I'm sitting at my table where my device is, students are saying across the room, hey, Mr. C, I'm ready for you to take a look. It's not finished, but I want you to look at it. So I'm sitting at my computer, and I'm watching their Scratch story, right? And it's amazing, because I don't even know how to explain it. It's just so cool that they're not walking up to me. Some do. Some come up to me with their computer and like, take a look at this. But a lot of them are starting to say, hey, I'm over here doing this, and so I need you to do that over there. And so basically we're killing two birds with one stone, which is really cool and efficient. And we're just, the time is being used effectively right now doing this writing work. So I just thought I would make that connection. I don't know what to think of coding yet. I don't think it's the be all and end all. I feel that there are others that feel that way. I think I'm more balanced right now with it. I see that it's one other tool students can use to learn more or to demonstrate their learning. But I'm not, it's, for me, it's just not the be all and end all, right? Like do you get what I mean by that? There are some people that are just all over it, and it's happening a lot with their students and in their classrooms. And for me, that's not the case. I guess if you had to look at what I indulge in as a teacher with my students, I love to get devices into their hands. But I guess that's my weakness, right? Like the paper and pencil, it's not a balanced 50-50. And now that I'm saying that, I'm thinking, should I balance it 50-50? Do I need to talk to my kids about that and see where they're at with that? So even talking about what they're doing and how they're doing it has me reflecting on the balance. And I know I'm not balanced. So do I need to achieve balance? Do I need to bring it closer to 50-50? I don't know. I'll have to consider it and talk to my students.
Yeah, it's I've tried in small pieces to introduce coding, and I get part of it is I guess an unfamiliarity. Some of the terminology, I like the words are kind of important to me. I mean, I find following any feed about including coding in the classroom, and inevitably you're going to come across some conversation that puts coding and computational thinking, and sometimes even mathematics, into the same string. And, you know, I think in some ways my thoughts about pursuing coding might be similar to someone listening to this podcast thinking about podcasting. As in, I think there's probably a real complex way to go about introducing coding that my brain is hooked on. Like almost like it has to be really complex. And I think that's just my lack of knowledge around it. I've played with Scratch. My students have played with Scratch. I haven't worked nearly hard enough to include it as an extended activity at all. And, you know, that's just time and place, and I haven't got there. Where I get philosophical on it is trying to understand, I guess this past week, I had a conversation with a student around talking about there's previous successes in a particular in their English course. And I was asking the student if they knew, or if they could explain their success so far. Could they kind of break it down, how they arrived at the mark that they arrived at? And they couldn't. So the mark that's on their credit counseling summary is like a gift to them. It was something that it was given. They didn't have a sense of what they did to earn it. And I think that's I had other conversations coming out of that, but it comes to mind because I think that coding gives you an answer. It's that answer to that I was looking for from the student. I wanted to know what was the source code to them succeeding in their English credit. And they didn't know what it was. And it strikes me that there's a whole lot inside of that where, you know, was it that the course was easy? Was it that they were highly skilled? Was it that, you know, there's so many things that they had some good assignments sometimes, some bad assignments other times. Like there's so many little pieces, but they couldn't express any of that. And it wasn't just a one-off. I came back to it a couple times where the student had a couple different opportunities to articulate and reflect on what brought them success. And I think coding represents a little bit of the behind the curtain to, I want to say a necessary skill, but I don't know if that's exactly it. But it strikes me that it reveals the nature, and it reveals a skill set that just getting closer to that understanding of what is happening inside or behind our digital devices, I do believe is an important literacy. Fluency literacy, I think it's an important thing to get to. In the same way, I do think that's important in writing, that we understand the difference between a subject and a predicate, or a noun and a verb. Whether we spend a lot of time slicing that up in our sentences, I think it's good to be able to map that out. So to look at a paragraph and to understand those connections. So that's kind of where coding is for me. I haven't worked nearly enough to include it in my dailies, but I do believe that I think it's a necessary fluency to have some capacity to understand what's going on behind the scenes. I can remember I put out a tweet, it was probably 2 years ago. And it was sort of, I think I jumped into a conversation that was trying to sort of pull apart a little bit ELL programming. And one of the things I put in there, I forget the complete context, but it was a consideration. Would we consider learning programming as a second language? So instead of saying French is automatically included as a second language that students have to take, would we open that conversation up and say, could we consider a specific computer language to be to suffice as that second language? And that was just oil and water. That never came together well. I think I came late to the conversation, and you just kind of I missed the point. I wasn't in step, so I was kind of, no one really talked to me. But it has stuck with me in some ways, that how we perceive the placement of coding. Is it a method to build video games? Is it a method to read the world? Is it an analytical tool? So it's not necessarily we have to understand the products that we see, but does it help us in other areas? Does it connect with reading literacy? Does it speak with oral literacy? So I'm kind of in that space with it. I would like to include it, and I would also like to believe that I could include it. I'm not quite sure why I haven't pushed that envelope. It could be my context. I don't have focused, dedicated time to explore it in a way that I would like, but I don't know. I could be making excuses too. I could be.
Well, you can't push everything, right? That's the thing. So
It's true.
whatever you're doing with your students right now is what you're doing. And maybe perhaps there are people out there who are not doing what you're doing. You can't push it all. This is something that has come up many times when I've had the opportunity to talk to other colleagues about integrating technology in the classroom. And just kind of like the way I do things in my classroom is that you can't have it all. I mean, I like to think that I'm someone who goes from one thing to another, trying it out, trying to see if it can be incorporated, trying to see if my students have any interest in it. But you just can't do it all. If you do, then I feel like you're going to lose something. I've not met anybody who does do it all. Like you and I both know that if we need to talk to somebody about virtual reality, we know a couple of people that spend a lot more time working with that with their students. 3D printing, we know people who are doing that. Maker spaces, like there's just, I mean, you can jump in here and there and see where it goes, or your students could bring it to you, but you just can't do it all. And so last year at this time, well, actually not last year at this time, it's December, it's the hour of code, because they make it so easy to jump in at a variety of different levels that it's like, well, why not? Why not give them the opportunity? It's on the internet, it's free, it's relatively safe when you follow the hour of code stuff. So let's just give it a shot and see how it goes. And then taking it up a notch is using that coding to integrating it into the curriculum, into what you're doing, and getting the students to do both. So, you know what, like you just can't, you got to do what you got to do. So in your context, I'm sure if a kid came in and was like a master coder and said to you, listen, why can't I do some of my history using programming or code? I'm sure you'd be like, yeah, sure, go for it. How's this going to look? you know, tell me more about it. But
Teach me.
Yeah.
And even go that, like, and I'm also cool with that. Like, cause I've read the lifelong kindergarten book. I did the activities that went with it. I have a couple pieces on Scratch. I can appreciate it like I appreciate a toolbox, but it didn't infect me like a virus. And sometimes you're right. I need to find some of the people. I think that's where the social element comes in, to be around people that I'm likely to want to imitate in some ways. Like it becomes infectious. Like, oh, I love what that's the thing. That's the unicorn that I was looking for. I kind of get the componentry, but that's the project I needed to see. So
yeah, so that's what I'm talking about. It reminds me of my new student who's learning English. He's from the Philippines. And so when he's doing his mathematics or his writing, even his reading and oral work, he incorporates his first language into what he's doing because he knows that that's going to lead him to success. And I'm really proud of him, and I'm really happy that he's open to it, because I've taught other students who, you know, refuse to use their first language at school for a number of different reasons. But this young student, he's not interested in that. He's interested in, how do I get to where you want me to be? Well, I can do this work. I can get to where you want, but I'm going to have to use my first language. And I'm like, okay, do it. Do it. And along the way, I'm going to learn something about your first language because I don't know anything about your first language. So I guess for me, it's that bigger picture. What can we do to get the kid to where they need to be? Right. And so it's like you said, it's the whole language thing. It's a way of operating, a way of understanding the world. My new student is trying to understand the world the same way that most of my students are in English, but he doesn't have the English. So he's doing it with his mother tongue. And I think that's fantastic. And he's happy and I'm happy. And I mean, these days, it's kind of nice to go to work, to go to school and be happy. It's nice. I mean, it's not, I don't think some would argue that you don't need to be happy at school, but it's always good to feel good along the way. And so thanks for engaging me in that talk about coding.
It's you bring, I want to share just because I was thinking about working with students and having them integrating their home language into the classroom, into the English speaking classroom. One of the things I learned pretty quickly is that some courses in some high schools are landing spots for students when they arrive. And some of those landing spots are softer than others. So it was often that I would have students that were just beginning to break down English language code. They would land in my hospitality class. So it was a constant global classroom, which was awesome. I mean, as far as foods and experiences and stories, it was awesome. But I learned within that course, I was talking to my colleague Pam yesterday about 3-part lesson design, and just that idea of hooking the kids and then getting to the meat in the middle and then kind of consolidating. And it was sort of in a suggestion we were talking bits and pieces about, because she wanted to diversify in how she did some of her counseling, and she helps facilitate a counseling course. So we were just talking about lesson design and some of the stuff that, you know, as far as the philosophy of pedagogy and current thinking on pedagogy, what I don't even think about anymore, but would never necessarily be shared out to her in her context. So I was sharing about the almost infinitesimal way that you can slice up that minds on, the action part, and then the consolidation. Within the minds on, you can actually have a mini minds on, a mini lesson, and a consolidation, and so on. It gets smaller and smaller. And she's like, what? You mean it's not just like a 3-step? I'm like, no, you can have like as many as you want, and over a period of time, right? This doesn't necessarily be one day. You can spend the first week doing a minds on activity that's leading to a major thing in the second week. So she's just kind of mind blown there. But it brings to mind, if you can exist in that complexity, and we'll come back to how you and I now are on doing something on the flip side of podcasts, where we see we're still doing a great podcast, but we're not bound. We're bound by the rules, but we look at the rules differently. We see that there's more space in there. It's all in there. There's enough space in there for us to do this and to do whatever our private podcasts are. So one of the tasks I had in that hospitality class was a presentation. One of the expectations is that the kids explore different jobs in hospitality, and there's different sectors. So what that amounted to was something that was a little bit like a Pecha Kucha presentation. So pictures only, and speaking like they were presenting at a job fair. So for example, your research would entail, if you wanted, they were presenting 3 sectors of their choice. So let's say you picked restaurants as one of the sectors. Well, what you would be presenting is, how would you get a job at that restaurant? So if you wanted to present McDonald's, you would be laying out a plan for the other 16-year-olds in the classroom about how do you go about getting a job at McDonald's. And you're speaking to the benefits that are offered a teenager, a bunch of different things, your hourly, some of the skills you would need. And so the students that where English was not their first language, one of the spaces that I opened up to them, as well as asynchronous presentations, like I never had it all just in the class. There's a lot of access points, but one of the other ones that I included was they could present in their own language. I said, you have to do your research and you have to put the script together in English. I want the English script, so you have to do the work of the translation for me. So I would get a script on the side. I would get their annotated research. I would get their slide deck. And then I still wanted them to present. So what I said to them, you can present in whatever language you want. All that I ask is that you bring other language speakers with you and make sure those language speakers have some comfort in English. Now, remember, the Pecha Kucha style is like images only, very few words. So the hook is still that you have to speak to your research. And then what I would do is I would come up to the front and I would have a conversation with the audience about the quality of the presentation. So instead of me waiting, I would sort of use that group as the landing point. And I can't tell you how often the exact same student that didn't ever do a presentation in their English class because they weren't necessarily comfortable standing up and revealing how and what they knew. The kids in the class, I would turn and I would ask their friends, and every single question that I asked about quality of presentation, what did you think of this part of getting a job at McDonald's, they would respond back in English. And they didn't have access to the script. They only had access to the kid that just presented in front of them. But I will say, I spoke to that at a staff meeting one time, and I just had blank faces in front of me. They're like, they did a presentation. And I even had staff walk in a couple times because sometimes these presentations were done at lunch. So they would come in, and I would always say, even if somebody comes in, you keep presenting. It's on the person coming in to be polite and respectful and recognize that something's going on. You're not going to pause. Don't break your train of thought. But I would have teachers coming like, Clough, I didn't know that you could speak Farsi. I'm like, I can't. This is awesome, though. I can't speak Farsi or Mandarin, whatever the languages are going on. It was a really cool presentation. I had the script at the side. I had their timing, so they knew their timing. But I think that's you make me think of that. You make me think of sort of, how did we get there? But you just sparked up that idea that sometimes when it's the, maybe force feeding the method, the absolute need to include coding, and maybe not taking into account some of the kids that are in front of you is one problem. But the second part is being open to when an alternative way to look at what you're teaching is presented back to you. Do you notice this does work? Right back when we first started talking about, are you taking the time to notice that something is really cool in front of you there? Or are you going to go with what you know? So, plus those kids coming in, often they brought food from their home cultures. And I got to say, like, I ate well.
That's the bonus, the food.
Yeah.
Clough, that sounds like homework for this week.
Tell me, shape it. You don't go here often.
No, I don't, because it's not my buzz. I don't like homework. But it sounds like the homework would be to stop and look around and be aware of the differences or the opportunities that can be in front of you when you're not sticking to the path. That's what I would say. But You probably put it a lot better.
No, dude, that's good. Did you even notice this week that it was a little bit brighter in the morning?
Nope.
Your time travel in the morning to school, you didn't notice that like at 7 a.m. it's a little brighter outside?
No, dude. This week has been a difficult week, and so my drive to school, has me thinking about a myriad of things and not noticing that what you just brought to my attention.
Check it. We noticed it. My kids, we noticed a few sunrises this week, and it's funny. So we know that it's about, let's say, max a 5-minute drive from our house to the kids' school. So this morning, and we generally leave around the same time, they only just noticed this morning. Now, it's something that I've noticed in bits and pieces, some of the damage that winter has done to some people's fences, and they've also in our area started to clear the sidewalks with one of those like a mini tractor, and it's just completely trashed like the fronts of people's lawns. Like it's just because the blade going through and just like clear cutting, right? So it's a thing, right? It's this past week, my kids have started to notice things outside that I know a couple weeks ago you wouldn't have been able to see because it was too dark. I was noticing it, well, because I grumble about the grass in the front, but they're starting to notice it. And then at that point, it's like, wow, 7 a.m., there's light outside now. So there's something kind of cool to that. You get the sense of change in the air that we're moving towards. Like you said, you got Jace tickets. You have already embraced the change. You are looking at summer and saying, I'm waiting for this, but waiting for it in a way that's planned and hopeful. So maybe that's the thing, noticing the things that are hopeful.
I'm up for that. I'm up for that. So I hope you have a good week.
And you too.
I'm looking forward to possibly talking again next weekend about our week and how it went and what kind of EDU adventures we got slipped into or decided to start.
I look forward to it, dude.
Take care.
You too, man.